Greetings again, Trinity Church. Welcome back to Feeding from Afar. I hope you're enjoying the beautiful weather. What an amazing, glorious day that the Lord has created for us. And though we are quarantined, I hope that many of you, if not all of you, can enjoy this gorgeous weather. We're going to continue going through Psalm 2, looking at the poetics of Psalm 2, and hopefully really nail down some of those things that the psalmist David here, the poet, was trying to communicate even with his poetry. So we're going to look at stanza 2 of this 4-stanza poem in Psalm 2. So get your Bibles ready. The first thing I want to see as we start with Psalm 2 is, again, to note in the Hebrew poetry is the seconding effect, or the parallelism effect that it does. We see strong forces of parallelism, paralleling going on, seconding, heightening, intensification. And you can see it really strongly in verses 4 and verses 5. Verse 4 begins with a simple statement in line A. He who sits in heaven is laughing. And then notice the intensity when you get to line B. The Lord is mocking at them. He went from sitting and laughing to now he is mocking. This is something that we might have to wrestle with our mind is what does it look like for God to mock? But the point here is not to get sidetracked on that so much as just notice the poetic intensification from verse 4a to verse 4b. We see the same thing in verse 5. He will speak to them in his anger, that's line A, but what's more, in fury he will terrify them. That's B, what's more. So notice he's speaking in line A, but now in line B, he's terrifying them. He's doing it in anger so far, but now he's doing it multiple times. Fury and terror, he is speaking to them. So you see that intensity occurring in verses 4 and 5. So we see a little bit of that intensification, what we call sometimes seconding. And so I want to continue now looking at more of the nuances of the poetics in verses 4, 5, and now also verse 6. As we come to verse 4, what I want you to see here is that with all the poetics going on, there's not a lot going on in verse 4. In fact, that's one of the poetic devices in this verse. That Hebrew poetry can communicate so much in these short, what we would call very terse statements. So if you look at verse 4, it's composed of only 6 words in Hebrew, and that's a 2-phrase statement. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And yet, look how many words it takes in English to pull that out. The one who sits in heaven is laughing. The Lord is mocking at them. It takes us almost twice as many words, but in Hebrew poetry, they can communicate a lot of important features in just a few words. And that's one of the marks of Hebrew poetry. They're avoiding using extra words, like the word the is not used, though it could have been, and we supply it. Like, for example, we would say in the heavens or in heaven, but there the word is not even needed. And Hebrew poetry is very terse, very short statements to communicate a very sharp point. And notice we have a very symmetrical phrase where we had the Hebrew verbal system is broken up in prefixed and suffix verbs, the green verbs being the prefix and the red ones being the suffix. Well, notice we only have 2 green verbs here, and it's very symmetrical, and it's very short and very terse. And so this is the first feature that we see in verse 4. Verse 5, it changes a little bit from the short terse, though that is still the short terse statements. But then we get to another one of those chiastic structures. After we have the narrative word then, just simply as, then, notice you have at the outsides the 2 green verbs, kind of bookending these statements. And within that, you have a prepositional phrase started with this preposition, and this prepositional phrase started with the same preposition. This word right there is just the word and in Hebrew. So you can see it in the English there, the verb with the as, the narrative beginning, verb, and then it ends with a verb, then the prefix in and the prefix in. So what this looks like is another one of those chiastic structures. Here's a better way to view it. You can see the chiasm happening between these words. See it here as well. We even try to do that in English. Now what's really interesting is that if we notice that some of the chiasm isn't as perfect, at least not on the surface, but if we look at it very carefully, it turns out to be very perfect. For example, it begins and ends with a verb, and notice the way I translated this verb, it says he will terrify them. That mo ending there, or the o ending there, is the them here that's added to the verb. Well, we have that same concept with a verb plus unto them. So you have verb, unto them, prepositional phrase starting with n. Then the and with the n prepositional phrase, in fury, verb, them. So you have identical yet reversed in order structure in verse 5. This is a very beautiful and eloquent poetic phrase in verse 5, speaking of God's anger and fury. Then we come to verse 6. Verse 6, it's kind of difficult to say what's happening in verse 6. Typically, Hebrew poetry is done in what we call a bicolon or two-phrase line. This one, it could be considered a two-phrase line. This is what this little caret guy is trying to indicate. But it could also be what we call one long monocolon. There's some question marks about that. Regardless, the point is we only see one verb, and that's kind of interesting. That sets it apart. And what you'll see is verse 6 is as I've argued before, almost getting to the peak of the volcano. Verse 7 is the other side of the peak, and that is the hottest, the most intense part of the psalm. And this is one way to indicate that in verse 6 is a short monocolon. But what we notice here is that there's a lot of E sounds. Wa'ani, Naskati, Malki, Alt Zion, Har Kodesh, Kodshi. And so notice you have the E sound going again and again and again. And that E sound is simply the word me or my in Hebrew. In fact, this is the word me. And so we translate this, and me, or as for me, I installed my king, so there's the I for that, my king upon Zion, the mountain of my holiness. And again, it's me, it's my, this is what I'm doing as for me. And what we're getting a sense of through this, what we call assonance, this repeated vowel sound, this rhyming sound, we're getting forced through our ear gate this huge truth that God is the one doing this. He is sovereign. He is working out his decree. And so every time our ears hear this E sound, our thoughts are going to God's sovereign installment of his king. So what do we make of all this? Well, we can wrap it up with that theme in verse 6 of God's sovereignty. That God's sovereignty is the theme of the second stanza. While the nations, kings, the nations, the kings of the earth, they're plotting that we saw in stanza 1, God is not moved. While he is sitting in his throne in heaven, they're the ones, the nations, the kings of the earth, they're plotting, they're scheming, they're devising, they're even taking their stand, it says, but God is sitting. And he's laughing at them while they're trying to organize and conspire and plot a plan. He simply laughs. And then in verse 6, we hear what his speaking is. Verse 5 says that he's going to speak in fury and that he's going to terrify them. What is that terrifying speech? That he is simply going to sovereignly install his king, and there's nothing that they can do about this. This is the poetic force of the terseness, of the chiastic structure, of the E-sounding words in verse 6. And basically, we have a repetition of what we might think of from Daniel 4, verse 35. Who can stay his hand or say to him, what have you done? In God's sovereignty, we cannot stop that unmovable force that we call God's sovereignty. If God speaks it, it will be so. And this is the poetry of stanza 2 of Psalm 2. Lord bless you.